Buenas tardes a todos, buenas tardes a todas. Yo haré una presentación muy corta de Andrés Velasco porque tenemos 1 hora y quisiéramos escucharle lo más largo posible. Bueno, es casi necesario presentarlo. Andrés es economista, político, tiene una trayectoria brillante, fue ministro de Hacienda del gobierno de Bachelet, estudió en las principales universidades americanas, Yale, Columbia, MIT, Harvard, y hoy es el director general de la Escuela de Políticas Públicas de London School of Economics. Dicho esto, Andrés, la idea es que tú hables por unos 25-30 minutos sobre los desafíos económicos y políticos de América Latina frente al mundo complicado en lo cual nos ubicamos, y ahí pasaremos a una conversación entre nosotros. The floor is yours. Andrés, muchas gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación.
Muchas gracias a ti, Sergio. Buenas tardes, buenos días, dependiendo de dónde estén ustedes en el mundo. Veo muchos amigos y muy queridos y muy respetados en la pantalla, así es que es doblemente un placer estar aquí. Sergio me dio instrucciones de que yo hablara en inglés, y yo como soy chileno, soy muy disciplinado y muy ordenado y le voy a hacer caso. Así es que tengo una presentación que está en inglés y la voy a compartir en la pantalla. Pero por supuesto que la conversación posteriormente la podemos tener en portuñol, en español, en inglés o en la... Ahí, ¿se ve bien?
Sí. Se ve bien.
Perfecto. Bueno, un gusto tremendo. Lo que voy a hacer yo es compartir algunas reflexiones sobre dónde creo que está América Latina. Y por eso la presentación se llama Latin America After the Pandemic, Recovery, Stagnation and Instability. So essentially, I want to start with how we did. I want to talk a little bit about short-term growth. I want to talk a bit more about long-term growth. I want to distinguish among 4 different syndromes in the region that account or help account for the weak long-term growth. I want to say a word or two about income distribution, and I finally want to talk about politics. So let me jump right in here. So the basic fact that I'm sure everybody at this call knows is that as a result of the pandemic, the region took a very big dip in, these things are not labeled, but this is year 20, 21, 22, and 23. Apologies for that. So clearly we had a big dip, and everybody knows that. Brazil didn't have a particularly big dip for reasons that are known to everybody. We had a very quick recovery in most countries, and again, because Brazil fell less, the recovery in Brazil was somewhat less abrupt. Countries that fell more, like Peru, to some extent, like Chile or others, had more abrupt recoveries. But the name of the game here is recovery. In most countries, only in the course of 2022 has the level of output returned to the pre-pandemic level of output. But the point that I'm more interested in is what happens after that. I simply want to, overemphasize or, emphasize a lot the fact that growth this year is very mediocre, and the only exception for that is Colombia. And in Colombia, that clearly being an oil-producing country, the Putin aggression and war have had a positive side effect on Colombia. But growth is mediocre in the course of 2022, and growth is going to be even more mediocre for almost every country, or in fact, every major country in the region in 2023. It is quite striking that my own country, that used to be a fast grower, is now the worst performer among the major countries in the region. This is the IMF WEO projection. The IMF said -1 for Chile. I am perfectly prepared to say that next year will probably be between -1.5 and -2 for Chile. So I think Chile is going to have a performance that is really quite terrible. So why the sluggish pandemic or post-pandemic growth? To some extent because of short-term causes. There is an element of scarring. We all know that certain sectors will grow, certain sectors will shrink. The ones that grow slowly, the ones that shrink very quickly, and therefore what happens is a transition with low growth. Secondly, because of monetary and fiscal tightening, clearly there is an anti-inflation effort that is ongoing. I'm not going to have anything to say about that, but I'm happy to discuss it in the Q&A. And clearly, investment performance is very, very weak. And this is connected in many countries, Brazil included, Chile included, with what one might call rising political uncertainty. But what I really want to focus on is, sort of on long-term causes. I want to highlight three facts that are sort of well known, but the extent of them is maybe not really well appreciated. One is just, the degree to which the investment performance in the region is dismal. Secondly, the degree to which productivity growth in the region is dismal. And thirdly, the extent to which this is connected to what I see as a very weak export performance. So this is this picture that I'm going to show you here is taken from a recent paper by the Inter-American Development Bank, of which our friend Ilan will now be the president, and I think that's a good development for the region as a whole. This runs from the year 1990 to the year 2019, and there are lots of numbers here, but I just want you to focus on 3 or 4 numbers. First of all, observe that in this period, the region as a whole, in per capita terms, grew 1.7%. And that is less than half of what emerging Asia grew, and that's about what the advanced economies grew. So first observation, in this period in per capita terms, there was almost no convergence. Essentially, the relative positions of the advanced economies and of Latin America remain stagnant, except for 0.1% that is really, just noise. So first observation, we should be converging, we should be catching up with the rest of the world that is richer. We are not converging with the rich world. But secondly, and most strikingly, if you look at the contribution of capital accumulation and the contribution of total factor productivity, they are basically zero. They are basically zero, which is really quite an extraordinary thing. Another way of saying that is that the investment performance is such that capital accumulation makes zero contribution, makes nil contribution to per capita income growth. And, we don't think that TFP can ever be negative, because that means that we're forgetting things. And typically, unless we get to be of a very advanced age, societies don't forget things. But the basic fact is that this is a negative number. Strikingly, and just to say something that is somewhat more optimistic, the labor contribution is positive. And this means that, given that this is people working over total population, it means that more people are working. The name of the game here is the joining of women into the labor force. So while the news from TFP and capital accumulation are dismal, there's some good news here in the sense that, on average in Latin America, only about 40% of working age women work. If that converges toward advanced country numbers, which are, 60 for the US, 70 for the UK, and 80 for Northern Europe, then there's room for additional per capita income growth. And that's probably the one thing that is looking up in the region. The rest is not looking very good. Now, just to get a sense of the extent to which, this performance is not so great, and this is part of work that I'm seeing my friend Arminio Fraga here. Arminio and Guillermo Ortiz and I have been working on a joint paper, and what in the next 3 or 4 graphs that I'm going to show are taken from that. To know whether we're doing well or we're doing poorly, it helps to compare ourselves to a set of countries with roughly the same per capita GDP. So we constructed a set of peers, which includes Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Egypt, Hungary, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Poland, Romania, South Africa, and Thailand. And we have a number of estimates. I'm just going to show you a couple to give a flavor of where we are. The first one is that if blue is Latin America, blue is the peers and orange is Latin America, there's two striking facts. Three striking facts. The United States is one, so this means that the same machine and the same worker in Latin America produce 60% of what they produce in the US. The second striking fact is that this is either flat or slightly trending down. So our performance in total factor productivity, as you saw in the previous picture, is roughly 0. And last but not least, our TFP is worse in levels and worse in rates, or although roughly similar in rates to the peers. So compared to a bunch of countries that look like us, more or less in terms of the same level of development, we're not doing very well. The same is true if we think about investment. The Latin American rate of gross fixed capital formation is more or less flat, slightly falling in the last few years, and it's about 18% of GDP. For the group of peers, that's about 25% of GDP. Really a big gap here. And one thing that I want to emphasize is that this is not simply an inward-looking problem, it is mostly an outward-looking problem. One way of thinking of why it is that our productivity performance is so dismal is to ask ourselves, well, how do you become more productive? There are two ways of becoming more productive. One is that you get better and better and better at what you're doing, but that's hard because very soon you run into diminishing returns to scale. Very soon you begin to run out of steam, so to speak, in how much more productive you can become. The other way is simply to move resources to new areas, to new products, to new sectors where you can become more productive. And unless you're Brazil, which is a very big country, developing new sectors means penetrating new markets, exporting more. And this is the point where Latin America doesn't look so good. Again, this is exports of goods and services, a share of GDP. Beginning in 1960 and ending in 2020, you see a slight trend up in Latin America, but the trend is less pronounced than it is from the peers. And the final level is, in fact, quite a bit lower. This is 35% for the peers, nearly 40% for the peers, and only about 23% for Latin America. This is weighted by GDP, so maybe Brazil plays a very big role. Maybe if we took out Brazil, the numbers would be slightly different, but still not a stellar performance. And then this is an index that I like a lot. My friend Arminio is not convinced that it is that revealing. This is calculated by Ricardo Hausmann and his team at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and is an indicator of how complex your export basket is. And if you do a growth regression, I am aware that growth regressions are a little bit out of fashion, but if you do one anyway, in fact, export complexity today is a pretty good predictor of growth in the future. This, for reasons that I will not go into, this can be positive or negative. I don't want to spend time on that. But the basic fact is that the complexity of the Latin American export basket is flat and low. The complexity of the peers is high and rising. And this means that if we want to play the game of trying to predict future growth, this is a predictor of future growth that does not suggest a very strong growth performance for Latin America as a whole. So bottom line, Latin America is doing pretty poorly when it comes to growth. Now, I want to argue that, in fact, the story is in Latin America is not simply a sort of a one-story show. There are at least 4 different cases which merit some attention, and I will not have time to go into them, but I just want to sort of highlight them because they may be worth discussing. There are some countries where you would not expect any growth to happen because endemically the macro story is very, very weak. Venezuela is the most obvious case. Argentina is less obvious, but still quite concerning. And Ecuador, in parentheses there, may be another case of very extreme macro vulnerability. You wouldn't expect a lot of growth there. You don't get a lot of growth there. End of story. The more interesting story, I think, is of the countries with fairly good macro fundamentals, where Colombia, Peru, and Chile are certainly there. Maybe Uruguay most recently in particular. And here, the striking thing is that these four countries, particularly Peru and Chile, grew very, very fast, but that era of very fast growth is over. So having a strong having a strong macro performance is surely important, but not sufficient. Then there's the case of Mexico, a country that does incredibly well when it comes to export diversification, which does incredibly well in terms of an export performance, but where the economy simply, on average, grows very, very, very little. And of course, what happens in Mexico is that you really have two economies. You have a smallish but very dynamic export economy, but that is really an outlier within a much larger economy of very low productivity and very low growth. And then, of course, we have Brazil, where I will not say anything about why Brazil is unique, because everybody in the room knows more about Brazil than I do. But Brazil does not look like Mexico. Brazil does not look like Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And, God forbid, Brazil does not look like Venezuela or Argentina. But the two themes that I want to highlight here is that, first of all, the binding constraint to growth is not the same in every case. In some cases, like Argentina, the obvious binding constraint to growth is macro instability, but that is not the case in Colombia or in Peru or in Chile. And maybe in other countries, the binding constraint to growth is a weak export performance, but that's not the case of Mexico. The point here is that we need to be more careful in the way we do growth diagnostics, because we tend to focus on two aspects of what is holding countries behind, and typically the story is a bit more nuanced. The story is a bit more complicated. And of course, macro stability is very important. I don't have to persuade people on this call that is the case. It is a necessary condition for success, but what a number of countries, including my own, including Mexico, suggest it is not a sufficient condition for sustained growth. Let me say a little bit about social indicators and inequality, because this is often the center of the discussion today, and a few of the things that are often said make sense. A few of the things that are said often don't make sense, so it may be worth making some distinctions there. The first thing that we need to remember is that, in fact, if we look at the quality of life for people in Latin America, the quality of life has been going up. In intellectual circles, it is fashionable to be pessimistic. And, there's a lovely recent book by Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, in which he says, if you go to a polite dinner party and you come across being optimistic, people will give you funny looks. It's not polite to be optimistic. But in fact, this is the Human Development Index. Red is Latin America, blue is the peers. You see a very similar trajectory, maybe declining slightly for Latin America in the last decade, while the peers keep rising. But from 1990 to the present, there isn't a very sharp distinction. So before we get too pessimistic, the fact is that when we take a broad look at conditions of life, including economic conditions, but including a bunch of other things like health, access to water, education, etc., the region is doing better. The other thing that's important to notice is that until the pandemic, and we don't really have a lot of numbers since the pandemic, the region was also improving when it came to income inequality. Again, it is very fashionable to say, yes, of course, we're becoming more and more unequal by the day. That is not true. What this picture shows is the Gini coefficient for every country in the sample. The blue are the peers, the red is Latin America. In the horizontal axis is 2018, the vertical axis 2006. This is the 45-degree line, and therefore, if you are over the 45-degree line, what's been happening is that you are improving, in that you used to have a higher Gini coefficient than you had in the most recent measurement of 2018. And you can see that every one of the major countries of the region is above the 45-degree line. Brazil is almost on the line, so not much action there. But in Peru, in the Dominican Republic, in Ecuador, in Uruguay, you see substantial drops in the Gini coefficient. That is not true in Turkey, that is not true in Bulgaria, that is not true in Indonesia, that is not true in Hungary. Other countries of roughly the same level of per capita income, where the Gini coefficient, in fact, got worse between 2006 and 2008. So again, it is easy to get very, very, very depressed about this, but this is one area where until the pandemic, we were not doing too badly. I suspect once the numbers post-pandemic are in, we will have some backsliding, but how much is anybody's guess. Now, before we get too optimistic, this is from the Piketty et al. Recent effort at using not simply surveys, but administrative tax data to capture not just labor income, but also capital income. It is true that in Latin America, the share of the top 1% has been rising from about 21% to about 25% of total income, whereas in the peers, that number is roughly stable at around 17 or 18%. So in this respect, there is a slight, not a massive, but there is an unequalizing tendency in the region, which does not show up if you just look at the gross Ginis. And then, just to summarize the story, a decade ago, especially during the commodity boom, the region seemed to be escaping what one might term a low growth, high inequality syndrome, with drivers of Ginis having to do, first of all, with the terms of trade boom, which meant more expenditure, which meant more room for redistribution. Brazil being a good example of that. But it is important to note, I'm not going to show it here, that the Gini coefficients were also connected to another phenomenon which has very little to do with government redistribution. The fact is that you had a big boom in access to university education, and therefore you had a big drop in Brazil, in Chile, in Colombia, in Mexico, in wage premium, that is to say, in the gap between the wages of high school educated and university educated people. The fact that you have a dropping wage premium has two repercussions. On the one hand, that's very good for the Gini, because at the very top of the Gini, you don't get the billionaires with capital income. What you get are high-paid professionals, the doctors and the dentists and the lawyers. If in relative terms, the dentists and the doctors are making less, that's very good for the Gini. Of course, it can generate political problems, and we've seen that in my own country, because you have a generation of the transition, a generation that went to university, mostly to private universities, and went into debt to pay fees, expecting very high relative wages, a very high premium, but precisely over the last decade or decade and a half, the premium fell. So you have a generation that is the richest in Latin American history, which is the most educated ever in Latin American history, but which is upset because it is in debt and it is not making as much as it thought. Now, the problem, of course, is that post-commodity boom, we have not grown a lot. The growth capacity, as I just argued, is falling. So this particular dynamic in which you were getting more money for redistribution and dropping wage premia is likely to be running out of steam. So other things equal, I'm afraid one has to be cautiously less optimistic about the dynamics of the Gini in the years to come. But the jury's still out, among other things, because we don't really have any post-pandemic information. Once we do, we can say something more about this. And Sergio insisted that I talk about politics as a recovering politician. That's what my wife calls me. I am always happy to talk about politics, so I'll say a little bit about that. You know, we all know the Clinton advisor who used to say that, you know, it's the economy stupid. I am increasingly of the view that the problem in the region is the politics. One could even say it's the politics stupid. And I'm going to show you some data that suggests that, first of all, we're seeing a decline in institutional quality, which is quite remarkable, and which goes against the grain of what's going on in other regions of the world. We're seeing a collapse in reported trust in political institutions in the region, even in countries where historically you had high trust, like Uruguay, like Costa Rica, or like Chile. Of course, we've had spats of unrest and street violence in Chile and Colombia and Peru and Bolivia and Brazil. You had highly polarized and contested elections. Nothing wrong with contested elections, but plenty wrong with highly polarized elections. Brazil is not alone. Colombia had almost exactly the same thing. Chile had exactly the same thing. This is a new phenomenon. And needless to say, you have rising difficulties for governing in countries like Peru, like Argentina, like Ecuador, elsewhere. Let me just show you a few pictures here. This is a scatter plot of the average World Bank governance indicator. Again, the Latin American countries are orange. The extra-regional countries are blue. 1996 is in the horizontal axis, and 2020 is in the vertical axis. The point that I want to make here is that there are a number of countries in the region, including Argentina, including the Dominican Republic, including Ecuador, and most remarkably, including my very own Chile, where in fact the World Bank is suggesting a drop in the quality of indicators. In Chile, the drop has not been tremendous, but it is quite striking that, you know, the well-behaved country in the region is showing a decline. The other well-behaved country in the region, Costa Rica, is showing a slight decline, you know, hardly noticeable. Uruguay has improved slightly. You know, these are the three good children in the hemisphere: Chile, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. But both Costa Rica and Chile are below the 45-degree line. You also see that in other countries in the extra-regional. Oh, sorry, and here's Brazil as well. I had neglected to mention that Brazil is also in the declining performance camp, along with a bunch of other countries in blue, such as Poland, such as Hungary, such as South Africa, etc., etc. Now, if we look at the question in the World Value Survey, do you have a great deal of trust in government? The numbers are dismal. You know, in the peers, about 10% say yes. Mind you, this is a great deal of trust. A little bit of trust would put you in the 25% range. In Latin America, less than 5%. Again, less than 5% of people report saying that they have a great deal of trust in government. The starting point was always low, but the tendency is pretty clearly downward. And if you look at the Latino barometer for Latin America only, you have trust in other people, trust in government, trust in the judiciary, trust in political parties, trust in parliament. It's not a very sharp decline, and in fact, a couple of them, there's a slight increase recently, but overall, this is not a very strong performance. And if I were showing here not the region as a whole, but some of the countries where historically you had the best performance, such as Chile, such as Costa Rica, you'd see a more marked decline. So even in countries where historically people trusted institutions, you see a decline. And mind you, these are terrible numbers, right? You know, at the end, you might be getting excited because some of these things are pointing up, but this is 5%. This is 7%. So every single one of these lines is below 10%, okay? So, you know, the fact that there's a slight improvement here is no reason for breaking out the champagne. Fewer than 10% of people declare a great deal of trust in government in general, in judges, in political parties, and in parliament. Again, this is a Latino barometer. I want to argue, and I'm getting to the end of my remarks here before Sergio takes the microphone away from me, that there are plenty of problems in the region, but one problem that increasingly causes me to worry is the set of unique political arrangements we have. You can think of political systems as having two characteristics. One such characteristic is the political regime. You can be presidential or parliamentary. Of course, every country in Latin America, after the American model, is presidential. And secondly, you can have proportional regimes, like in Brazil, or you can have majoritarian regimes, as in the United Kingdom or the US. If you think about the world, if you have a 2x2 matrix, political regimes has two alternatives, electoral systems has two alternatives, 2 times 2 is 4, so you have 4 possible permutations. The only region in the planet where you have in every country a system that is both presidential and proportional is Latin America. And what this means is that presidents get elected, as Lula got elected last week, with more than 50%, because by definition, you have to get 50% to win a second term. But it is nearly impossible to assemble a parliamentary majority. This is the case in Brazil, this is the case in Colombia, and more strikingly, it is the case in Ecuador, in Peru, or in Chile. In Peru right now, the government has 8% of the assembly. In Ecuador, it has 10. The current Chilean coalition, if you look at Boric's Frente Amplio and his allies, the Communist Party, they have 6% of the Senate and 25% of the lower house. If you put the whole left together, even then you don't get a majority in either house in Chile. So I am increasingly of the view that the combination of presidential systems and very strongly proportional regimes have led to the weakening of political parties. Last time I checked, Brazil had more than 24 parties in parliament. Chile has 22. Peru has 17. De Gaulle said you couldn't govern France because France had 200 kinds of cheese. I would put it to you that you cannot govern a country where you have 22 political parties in parliament, or 24 as the case in Brazil, 22 in Chile. And of course, this means that governments get to office, they have a long list of promises they have made, they claim a political mandate to bring those promises into reality. That's what comes from a second round in which you get more than 50%, but in fact, you do not have such a mandate, you do not have a majority, you cannot do whatever it is that you said you would do, and in my view, this is a perfect recipe for frustration with democracy. So, not so great in economics, in my view, even worse in politics. That is the performance that one can observe in the region. And let me simply end by saying that, in my view at least, it is the political paralysis that is making it very hard to do anything on the economic front. And that is, in turn, what is causing the very mediocre productivity and growth performance we have seen recently. Sergio, half an hour exactly. I am not completely out of whack. I will hand the floor back to you. Again, obrigado, everyone. Very happy to be here.
Andrés, thank you so much. Excelente presentación. Yo quisiera proponer lo siguiente. Hay preguntas que nos llegaron desde afuera, por decirlo de alguna manera. Gente que nos está asistiendo, pero no está adentro del Zoom. Pero yo quisiera dar la preferencia a la gente que está en el Zoom para que hagan preguntas. Y yo trataré de identificarlas acá y darles la palabra. ¿Quién quieres arrancar? Yo podría arrancar si nadie se presenta. Andrés, entonces arranco yo con la pregunta.
¿Quieres que responda en inglés, en portuñol, en castellano?
Como
¿Qué
quieras,
más adecuado?
en inglés o en castellano, como quieras.
Ok.
Mi pregunta es sobre una preocupación especial con los sectores medios. Sean los llamados, las capas intermedias populares, gente que experimentó una ascensión en su vida, está mejor que su familia estuvo, o gente que era de una familia de clases medias más consolidadas. Por distintas razones, estos dos grupos, que son grupos muy amplios en términos poblacionales en América Latina y muy vocales desde el punto de vista político, están experimentando un gran sentimiento de inseguridad en relación a su posición social y económica, ¿no? Y esto, de alguna manera, nos hace avisorar una trayectoria de recurrente inestabilidad política en el futuro, ¿no? En términos de cómo enfrentar este fenómeno, en términos de políticas públicas, de una agenda de políticas públicas que pueda responder a las expectativas de ascensión social de las capas populares intermedias, ¿no? Y también de alguna manera de suavizar esta transición de clases medias que eran muy consolidadas y ahora están bajo un régimen de menor seguridad en cuanto a su trayectoria económica y social futura.
Great question. Muy buena pregunta. So, the first thing we need to do is acknowledge, first of all, that the middle classes are much larger. Of course, I do not want to get into the technical debate of how it is that we measure the middle class, but if we roughly speak of people who have middle class status and whose consumption patterns are what we might call middle class, those groups are infinitely larger in the region. Let me take off my hat as an economist for a minute and put on my hat as a politician. You know, I ran in a presidential primary in Chile. I then ran in a Senate race in Chile. I lost both, so I'm 2-0, like Qatar against Ecuador yesterday. And what I can tell you is that the most common conversation I had on the street was someone, typically somebody 50 or older, coming up to me, and this is probably a non-random sample, but still saying, you have no idea how much better my children live than I live. And I am so proud of the fact that I grew up very poor and now I have a house. I have a lot of debt because I had to borrow to buy a house, but I bought my own home. My children are at university. Again, I am heavily in debt because the children are at university, but I am very proud of what I've done. I'm very proud of what I've achieved. Mind you, people don't say I'm very proud of what the country has achieved. People say I am very proud of what we, meaning my family and I, have achieved. Now, immediately after that, what that person says to you is, however, and the however is not so much about income distribution. I never met anybody who said, oh, but I'm so upset because some billionaire is getting so rich. What people go on to say is that they are very exposed to shocks of all kinds, because they say, yes, I have a house, but if I lose my job, I cannot pay the mortgage, so I may lose the house. And yes, my daughter is at university, but if I lose my job or if I get sick, I will not be able to pay her tuition and she may not finish her education. Or they will say, in theory, I have public health insurance, but I know that if I get sick, the waiting list to get an operation is 6 months, and therefore I will have to pay private. And if I pay private, I will be bankrupted, my savings will be gone, etc. Let me say the same thing in the jargon of economists. For the big middle class in Latin America, the problem is not the average of incomes, but it is the variance around that average. It is not the first moment of the distribution, as a statistician might say, it is the second moment. People are very aware that they live better, but they're terrified at the variability around that improved standard. And I emphasize this because a lot of the conversation in Latin America is about redistribution, and that's fine for all kinds of obvious reasons. Clearly, in a country like Brazil, there will always be a conversation about redistribution when the Gini is so high. but we don't talk enough about simply cutting off the tails of that movement in incomes, and that is not so hard to do. It has to do with insurance. And some of that insurance could be private, some of the insurance could be public, some of the insurance could be privately provided but publicly financed, and that insurance could be unemployment insurance, could be health insurance, could be insurance in the case that you cannot pay your mortgage. Bottom line, Sergio, I think we have a lot more to do in providing insurance to the middle class. Not redistribution, but insurance. That is what really causes people to get very upset. And one other thing, and I'm just going to offer a conjecture because I'm not sure what I'm about to say. I think there's a big debate in the political science literature about what causes populism. And there are the economic insecurity people and the cultural change people. If I look at the 48.5 or 49% of the vote that Bolsonaro got on the second vote, if I look at the 43% that José Antonio Cast got in the second round vote in Chile, if I look at the very, 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 very strong rejection of the Chilean constitution, in which nearly 2 out of 3 voters voted against the constitution, I think we also have the makings of a cultural change sort of hypothesis. A lot of the cultural change in the region has been very good. I am delighted that this region discriminates less against women, discriminates less against LGBTQ people. I am delighted that we have more rights, but there's an element along which that very fast cultural change has turned off some of the more conservative chunks of the middle class. That's a growing pain. Maybe it is a growing pain exacerbated by the excessively radical discourse of some groups on the left. This was very clearly the case in the in the Chilean constitutional conversation. Some of it will go away on its own. Some of it needs managing and handling. But I guess I will end here. The other thing that I'm saying is, I think the middle class is not simply upset because of an economic problem. There's increasingly a cultural tension that is also creating dissatisfaction in some chunks of the middle class, particularly the rural middle class and particularly the older middle class.
Very good. Now Pastori and then Eduardo Viola.
Thank you, Andres. You gave us a lot of food for thought. Let me stay with 2 points that you stressed on. First, it's politics more than economics. And second, you mentioned capture, which is high in Brazil. About politics, I think all countries in Latin America that you mentioned are suffering the same problem. Let's say there are no ways to have a parliamentary majority in the Congress because you have too many parties. That started long ago in Brazil, so I don't want to go along the story. But I remember before the approval of the re-election, we still had a manageable number of parties. Cardoso could make a coalition around a program because with 3 parties, MDB, PSDB, the present PSDB, and PFL, he could get majority in the Congress, and he did progress the ground of reforms. Now we have 30 parties. Now I go to capture. I can see capture from the private sector. Well, protectionism is one way of doing that. Impediments of doing brilliant tax reform that puts together all taxes on goods and services and transform them into a value added is turned difficult because there are interests in the sector of commerce and services which are against this reform. And the Congress is captured by that. But there is a third type of capture, which I'm interested in knowing if this happens in Latin America as well. Capture of the budget. Whatever is the president, let me use the case of Bolsonaro because that happened during his term. he needed to approve. Brazil had this ceiling on spending that is in the constitution. So he needed a constitutional amendment to spend over and above the ceiling because there were people starving. Okay, fair enough. I think that had to be done. But in exchange for the votes to approve that, the Congress imposed other spending, which turned to be what we call the secret budget in Brazil, orçamento secreto. So the rapporteur of the budget can allocate that money whatever he wants, and he doesn't need to put it public. It's guaranteed under the judiciary system. Is allowing that to happen, which poses to me one question. We are seeing, over and above what we have mentioned, a failure of our institutions. Institutions in Brazil are deteriorating so much. Then I go back to Acemoglu and to Robinson, and let's say without institutions that are inclusive, that are the kind of extractive institutions, you cannot grow. And if I have to make a criticism on Brazil, I would say we are building a country with extractive institutions. I'm smiling to that, not doing anything to change it. I say, are we alone in Latin America? Is that the case of all the other countries, or it's peculiar to Brazil?
I wish I could say, Afonso, that you're alone, but you're certainly not. Brazil is larger and more complex, and therefore the wrinkles are many, but the syndrome you describe is very common. And it's all kinds of capture from all kinds of people. I'll give you one very different example from my own country. Until a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we had a secret budget for defense that was inherited back from the days of Pinochet, and not even the Minister of Finance knew. I mean, I, as a Minister of Finance, did not have access to the information as to what the armed forces were doing with hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And changing that took Chilean democracy 25 years. Because the lobbying and the political pressures were incredible. That made it very, very difficult to, end something as ridiculous as, a secret law on using copper revenues for defense expenditures. That's no longer the case. But the fact that it took us 25 years to change it is a testimony to, how massive the element of capture is. Now, how do you get around capture? There's probably more than one way, but let me mention one which takes me back to the first half of your question. I am completely and totally convinced that at the root of our political problems is the decline of political parties. Brazil never had very strong political parties. Chile did, Colombia did, Mexico did, Uruguay did, and pretty much nobody does anymore. Uruguay still does to some extent. Why is that? Because they have different rules. So let me suggest 2 ways or 3 ways of strengthening political parties. First of all, you need a more majoritarian electoral system with a much higher threshold for getting into parliament. Again, it is not a coincidence that the United States has 2 political parties, that Britain has 5. Countries with more majoritarian systems have fewer political parties. Secondly, if you're going to have lists, and I don't think we're going to get rid of the system of lists in Latin America because it's too built into our system, the lists have to be closed and not open. That is to say, you have to vote for the party, and the party leadership gets to put people in a given order, which is what you still have in Argentina, which is still what you have in Uruguay. That gives the party leadership some control. So, you get voting along party lines. That is not the case in Chile, that is not the case in Peru, that is not the case in Colombia. And therefore, if you have a political party that is sagging in its support in the polls, what do? You recruit a bunch of football players and soap opera actors, and you put them on the list, and they do very, very well. And of course, good luck to you getting them to vote in any kind of coherent way afterwards. And last but not least, this is my third change. If there's going to be public financing, and I don't know how this is in Brazil, so I don't know if this change is relevant for you or not, the public finance has to go to the party and not to the individual. In Chile, public monies go to the individual, so the individual has absolutely no reason to pay any attention to the party. And if the individual wants to leave the party, the individual takes the money with him. And as a result, again, there's no incentive for party coherence, there's no incentive for party strength. Unless we change these things, we will not have a viable party system, and unless we have a party system that works, we will not have viable democracies. This is essential. Most economists tend to poo-poo this sort of thing. We should not. It is really, really important.
Viola.
Muchas gracias, Andrés, por la excelente presentación. Mi pregunta es, yo estoy de acuerdo contigo que el deterioro del sistema político y la cualidad de las instituciones es fundamental y tal vez más importante que la economía, pero me gustaría que elaboraras un poco sobre una cuestión de algún modo de la economía, que es cuál es el desfasaje entre el aumento tan grande de la población universitaria en muchos países, pero de otro lado, la calidad de la enseñanza universitaria. Hasta dónde la enseñanza universitaria, en general en América Latina, está dirigida a desarrollar las habilidades necesarias para las transformaciones tecnológicas profundas que estamos viviendo.
¿Contesto en castellano o en inglés?
Como quieras, Andrés. Bueno, en honor a Viola.
En honor a Viola contesto en castellano.
En español.
Para ir cambiando un poco. Eduardo, yo creo que tú pones el dedo en un asunto absolutamente clave. Es evidente que la matrícula universitaria ha subido muchísimo. Y aquí la experiencia de México, de Colombia, de Chile, de Perú y de Brasil es muy parecida. En Chile, que es la cifra que más conozco, una generación atrás, el 14% o el 15% de cada cohorte iba a la universidad. Hoy día en Chile es el 49%. 49% es más o menos lo que tiene Italia, lo que tiene España, lo que tienen los países europeos. Y por lo tanto, en materia de matrícula estamos bastante bien. ¿Cuál es el problema? Creo que el problema es, primero, que tenemos malos controles centralizados de calidad y segundo, que tenemos malos controles descentralizados. ¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Todo sistema universitario tiene dos maneras de controlar la calidad. Una es certificación, acreditación por parte del Estado. Y segundo, el mercado. Si tú eres malo, perderás alumnos. Si eres bueno, ganarás alumnos. Ninguno de los dos funciona muy bien en América Latina. La acreditación pública tiende a ser muy pobre, tiende a ser corrupta. En Chile tuvimos varios escándalos porque universidades privadas literalmente le pagaban en cash a los acreditadores, pero además porque tiende a ser muy formal, muy burocrática, mira muchos papeles, pero tiene muy poco de contenido. Y por lo tanto la acreditación centralizada funciona mal. La acreditación, perdón, el control de calidad descentralizado, el mercado también funciona mal, por una cosa que los economistas entendemos muy bien, que para que el mercado funcione necesitas tener información, y no tenemos información. Si yo pregunto, ¿cuál es el desempeño de los graduados de LSI, la universidad donde yo trabajo? Tenemos cifras de cuándo se graduaron, de qué trabajos tuvieron, de si siguieron estudiando, de cuánto ganaban al año 3, al año 5, al año 7, al año 10, al año 15, al año 20. Traten ustedes de conseguir esa información para las principales universidades de América Latina. Es absolutamente imposible de encontrar. absolutamente imposible de encontrar. Y por lo tanto, el mercado funciona mal, naturalmente, porque tenemos una generación de universitarios cuyos padres no fueron a la universidad. Los padres no tienen mucha capacidad para discernir lo bueno de lo malo, y los estudiantes tampoco tienen esa capacidad porque no cuentan con la información. Y por lo tanto, elegir entre carreras buenas, carreras malas, carreras con alta empleabilidad y con baja empleabilidad es muy, muy, muy difícil. Por lo tanto, no es para nada sorprendente que tengamos un problema de calidad. Ahora, la buena noticia es que es un problema razonablemente fácil de resolver. La economía política no es fácil porque las universidades se van a resistir. Traten ustedes, por ejemplo, de obligar a los profesores de las universidades que las evaluaciones sean públicas como deberían serlas, pero es algo que debería ser posible, ¿no? Digamos, de todos los lobbies del mundo, creo que el lobby de los profesores universitarios, yo lo soy, varios de ustedes lo son, seamos francos, no somos tan poderosos, ¿no? Debería ser posible hacer un cambio, de modo que ese mercado funcionara bastante mejor. Hoy día funciona muy mal.
Pedro Mana.
Sí.
¿Qué tal, Pedro?
Sí, qué bueno verte, Andrés. Excelente presentación. Voy a hablar inglés, porque hiciste tu presentación en inglés. You have shown us the low levels, in some cases declining trust in political parties, in politicians, in institutions, and in governments in some of the Latin American countries, and many of them. At the same time, I would like you to comment on what for me is a sort of a paradox. It's the following. At the same time that you have this level of skepticism about the functioning and the coordination capabilities, the degree of interaction between the executive and the legislative branch of many of our countries, you have a high and I would say rising demand for government trying to respond to these demands, these aspirations, these desires, these expectations of improvement, and they all converge for an increasing demand on the part of government. Many of these activities that you have discussed here, they are seen by many in our countries as government intensives. I say they expect that government would somehow respond to them. And I go to your point about the capture of, and especially it is in the budget or in decisions which express themselves in the budget, such as expenditure taxes and subsidies and incentives of all types, and attempts to respond to this legitimate demand for government action in regard to the social situation of our countries. Isn't there a paradox? I'd like you to comment on where you see this more visible between this skepticism, lack of trust, and at the same time, an expectation that it's up to the government to respond to this demands, social and economic in society. Would you care to comment?
Yeah. That's a very good question.
Andrés, sorry, before you start, can you save, let's say, 5 minutes at the end, because there is a question from the public that I would like to pose.
Sure. So we'll do Pedro's question and then the question from the public. Happy to do both. No rush. First of all, Pedro, it is true that people don't trust the government. It is also true that people don't trust anybody else either. I have been looking at the Latino Barometro with some care and the World Value Survey. And if you ask, do you trust politicians? People say no. But if then you ask, do you trust labor unions? No. Do you trust private businesses? No. Do you trust the media? No. Do you trust the Catholic Church? You know, once upon a time, the one institution everybody trusted, the Catholic Church, no more. We all know why. Sexual abuse, scandals, etc., etc. So when people say, I don't trust you, they're not saying something that is unique to the public sector. This is generalized distrust. Similarly, when people say, I want an end to abuse, I want help, I need more security, I need more stability, I don't think that is narrowly a statement about what we might call a government intervention. What people want is basically more security. if that security is delivered 100% by the government or 50% by the government and 50% by the private sector, I don't think people are that ideological. I'll give you one example from Chile, which I think is very revealing. If you ask Chileans, do you like the current Social Security pension system, which is private? Do you like the AFPs, the pension fund administrators? People hate them. People absolutely and totally hate them because, they have a cousin who retired last year, and that person used to make $500,000 pesos last salary, and today that person is getting 100,000 pesos. So it's 20% of his last wage. Terrible pension. But then you say, is the money in the IFP yours? People say, yes, of course. And you ask them, would you put that money into a government fund so the government would provide pensions? And people say, no way. The private sector is awful, but I'm not going to give the government the money. So you can read that evidence in two ways. You can say, well, there's generalized distrust, and we can't do anything because nobody trusts anybody else. Or on a more optimistic note, you can say, well, because there's generalized distrust and because there isn't a very clear ideological bent, there is room for being creative policymakers and for designing systems that are mixed, where you have some room for private insurance, some room for public insurance, and depending on whether it's health or education or pensions or welfare, you can have a different mix. So in the end, I think people are more interested in outcomes than they are in providers. That's not always clear because the discourse and the language about redistribution and insurance tends to come from the left, and the left tends to use the word state. But when you dig a little bit deeper, I don't see final users as being that narrowly ideological. And if I can add one other reflection from Chile, Chile just rejected a constitution that offered the biggest state ever with, by one count, 200 guaranteed social rights. And people said, no way, I don't want that. So I think in the end, citizens are wiser than we give them credit. They are distrustful, but they're also willing to explore new formulas, and that's where we have to go.
Thank you, Andres.
All right, let me now, Andres, ask you the question that came from the public, from Tatiana Salles. And the question is about threats and opportunities stemming from the growing geopolitical tensions between China and the U.S., opportunities and threats to Latin America. Your take on that in general, and more specifically, to what extent do you think the region can benefit from nearshoring?
Well, I'm delighted to get this question last because we can end on a more positive and less pessimistic view. I think there are lots of bad things that are happening in the world economy. Clearly, the criminal Russian invasion of Ukraine is one. Tensions between China and the US is another. China's increasing turn toward authoritarianism is yet another, etc., etc. But there's always a silver lining here. And let me mention 2 or 3 silver linings. The first one is that there is going to be some nearshoring. There's no question about that. And there are studies from Mexico that are very, very optimistic. A New York investment bank, I forget exactly which one, did a paper recently in which they estimate that Mexico could see, its exports to the US rise as much as 20% because of changes in supply chains, where an American company used to have one supplier in China. Now the American company says, I'm fine, I will keep one supplier in China, but I also want to have one in Mexico. Diversification, just in case instead of just in time, and all of that stuff. Now, the question is, that's Mexico. Mexico is very deeply integrated into the US already. Are we in South America in a position to take advantage of that? And I think the answer is it all depends. Are we going to have governments and firms that are ready to seize that opportunity? I don't know. I would be somewhat pessimistic, but I think it really depends on us. I'll give you one reason to be pessimistic. When I was among the negotiators of the Chile-US Free Trade Agreement, we negotiated a chapter which allows Chilean firms to participate in all kinds of public sector auctions to supply goods and services to the US government. You know how many Chilean firms have participated? And this has been in force for 20-some years. Zero, none, absolutely none. So we've been talking about policy failures. I think the question is also going to be, are Latin American firms going to seize those opportunities? I think those opportunities will be there. And the other thing I want to say is this. The pandemic brought another shock. It's called the Zoom shock. Think of what it is that we're doing. Most of you are in Sao Paulo, or a few maybe in Rio, or some are in Brasilia. I'm in London. We may have people in many other countries, in Argentina, or in Chile, or in the US. The potential for exporting services has gone up massively. Well, we tend to think about the exports of goods. I think we ought to be thinking more about exports of services. I'm a big fan of this guy called Richard Baldwin, professor in Geneva, an American, who writes about the unbundlings, the stages in the growth of trade that come from changes in technology. The first unbundling was, of course, the invention of the steam engine nearly 200 years ago. A second unbundling came from the invention of, modern freight containers, which made loading and unloading much quicker. The third unbundling came 25 years ago with the advent of email and IT. Richard Baldwin says that the fourth big unbundling will come now because you can be in, Ceará, and you can be exporting services to, Europe, the US, Asia, etc., etc. And to go back to the earlier question, Eduardo, we've trained a lot of professionals, and the question is, do we have jobs for those professionals? Well, maybe not in Brazil, but maybe they can provide services elsewhere. Maybe that guy who studied something and who's now driving a taxi in Buenos Aires can become a provider of services over the internet. One thing that we have going for us is that we're in the right time zone. We're at exactly the same time zone as the Eastern United States. The thing we don't have going for us is that the provision of services in time requires English skills. And that is one area where Asia is way ahead and where Latin America is behind. But we have the infrastructure, we have pretty good telecom, and we have the geography. We're in the right place. If we can add a few English language skills to the very strong upsurge in university enrollments we've seen, then we're in a good position to be a part of this fourth unbundling and export a lot more services. I think that's one mild but important reason for optimism in the region.
Andrés, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us today. It was wonderful to talk to you, wonderful to listen to you. And I would like to thank CDPP and Casas de Gasas for the partnership. And last but not the least, I would like to ask you permission to show the trademarks of the companies that support our foundation. And in doing so, here they are. Thank you, each and every one of them. And hope to see you soon.
Sergio, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I see lots of friends on the screen, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be sharing this screen with you. Big abraço.
Ok, abraço.
Abraço.
Grande abraço. Tchau, tchau.
Tchau.